There's a point that I think both our speakers have touched on, but more politely. Even as a student, my teachers and I would distinguish between what they called bastard Keynesians and Keynesians. And I think the root problem right now is the world's in the grip of the bastard Keynesians. And let me try to make that case. But on the theme that Jeff has introduced, what would Keynes say now? As a great economist, he would clearly have a subtle and deep understanding of our problems. Should he be here? He'd be proposing better remedies than the bastard Keynesians, who seem to believe that fiscal stimulus of demand is the main answer to our current problems. However, he had a very blind spot about wages, it seems to me, and I might come back to that. Whether he would have got over it at age 125, I'm not sure. But I think it is a blind spot that we have to think about, and will be a very, very practical blind spot in this recession and how we recover from it. As I said, I used to be a model builder, and I can't help but think in terms of models. And when we were all young, those of us who are no longer young, models focus mostly on the demand side, Keynesian influence. But you can't help but imagine that there's a whole bunch of markets and the supply and demand. This is really obvious, but it's not often thought about this way. And I think the great divide in economics now is between the equilibrium people and the disequilibrium people. Now, Keynes was a great disequilibrium analyst, as I tried to be. But you know, the equilibrium people think that you're in equilibrium even if you're jumping off the top of the Eiffel Tower, having carefully weighed up the costs and benefits of continuing to live. And on the way down, of course, you're in equilibrium, I guess, unless you figure you got it wrong. So, however, markets adjust at very different rates. You know, if you take the global markets for gold and oil, they seem to me they adjust very quickly. But expectations can be horribly wrong. When the price of oil got to $150 a barrel, it was an equilibrium price in Chicago, but was it an equilibrium price in any other sense? It was driven, it seems to me, by bubble type thinking. But if you're in an economy where trade unions are still powerful and wrong-headed, the 2 points there, information is still imperfect, or where people are deeply conservative about what they're prepared to work for, you're going to have labour markets adjusting very slowly. And that's perhaps the key to me, that'll be a great issue. But I recently did some work that I don't think is controversial, trying to measure what the real rate of unemployment is in Australia, and add to that the rate of underemployment, because there are surveys, would you like to work more hours, etc. And even at the top of our boom, the number is 12%. It's now gone up to about 14, and it's starting to go up quite sharply. So, almost by definition, if you've got a real rate of unemployment and underemployment of 12%, the labour market's not adjusting very fast. So, I don't think you need to debate that very much. Now, aggregate demand, of course, I think no need to talk about that. We've broken it down into 10, 12 categories in our bigger models. If you think about the supply side, though, it's much less well analysed. And I recently put myself through a crash course of modern growth theory. I found a wonderful book by L. Hannon Helpman. Did people know it? It's called The Mystery of Economic Growth, and I do want to give you the quote, which will take me. After we account for the accumulation of inputs, large differences in income per capita remain across countries. More than half of the cross-country variation of income per capita, even more so in the variation of the growth rate in income per capita, arises from difference in total factor productivity. And investment in research and development explains a substantial part of this variation, particularly in the industrial countries. Now, it leaves the question of what's the other half explained by, and my hypothesis is that Keynes, if he were around, would be saying, well, that's what I used to talk about with animal spirits, and in particular entrepreneurial flair. It's very marked. I looked again at the general theory and every third word's entrepreneur, I think, almost. He certainly had it in his mind. But so that's supply. That's what we normally think of as supply side stuff. And if you were really trying to fix an economy in a recession nowadays, and if you were Keynes, I think you would be focusing on innovations that freed up markets where they're not free and which encouraged entrepreneurial flair and research and development, which is, in my career and the work I do for governments, is where I'm trying to push them now. So naturally I'd say Keynes would agree. But let's just talk about aggregate demand for a moment, and I think Alex talked about it a little bit. But you know, if people are highly indebted and they get handed money, it's not very surprising that they'll pay down their debts. If you're highly indebted, you're in trouble, and particularly if you're worried about the future. So there's a sort of, within the bastard Keynesian framework, a reason to be wary about just handing money to people, which it seems to me so far has been most of the response in Australia. But the bigger point is about confidence. Now, Keynes talked about confidence all the time, animal spirits. And it seems to me that demand stimulus or supply side stimulus is likely to work if people feel that the government knows what they're doing and that they're doing it sensibly. But if it appears to be a sense of panic, or that they're not sure, people are not sure what's going on, I think the negative confidence effects might offset any direct stimulus effects. And by the way, that was a view that we debated in this university 40 years ago. So it isn't a particularly new view, but it might be highly relevant now when the whole world's in a state of blue funk, I think, about the state of the economy. Now let me make two other points. The banking system in the world is completely dysfunctional. Completely. What surprises me about the Obama response, and indeed the European response, is that if I'm right, that the banking gridlock is the one thing that Keynes would have most focused on. Why haven't they focused on it now? Now, I'm aware that the Americans have just announced a policy. It's ironic that, having sort of made a big fuss about obscene bonuses, which I'm quite capable of objecting to as well, but now they're going to let people get bonuses if they buy the debt cheaply and sell it at a big profit. So that disposes of some of the neoliberal criticism that Mr. Rudd's been peddling. But it seems to me that one thing that would be different, certainly than the bastard Keynesians, is that Keynes would be focusing above all on fixing the financial gridlock, whereas our current policymakers didn't focus on that. They focused on crude stimulus measures. Now let me just go to the wage flexibility or wage rigidity point. He certainly stated very clearly that wage cuts would not increase aggregate demand and therefore jobs, and that in any case one can imagine flexible wages in operation in, quote, highly authoritarian societies like those of Italy, Germany or Russia, but not in France, the United States or Great Britain. Now, many of you may know more about this than I do, but the one bit of analysis of the American experience with Roosevelt's spending was that what frustrated that was the fact that wages didn't fall. And so wages remained too high, whereas once the Second World War broke out, wages were fixed and inflation went up and real wages dropped, and suddenly America was fully employed. Certainly my reading of the Australian recovery from the Great Depression, the Arbitration Commission's 10% cut, plus the big devaluation, cut real wages, and as this article that Alex mentioned, I think not favourably, in Quadrant, makes that point. And I might add, Alex, I wrote this before I read this. My wife's the chairman of Quadrant, and she never lets me see the bloody thing. In case I get stupid ideas, I suppose. But I wanted to, there is an article in here that, and the point about wages is in Australia is made there, but I wanted to, the article's The Dangers of Keynesian Economics, and it is pretty neoliberal critique, I've got to say. But he references Keynes's last article, which to my discredit I'd never read. And I haven't read the original yet. It was called The Balance of Payments of the United States. It was published posthumously in the Economic Journal in 1946. This is Keynes, I find myself moved, not for the first time, to remind contemporary economists that the classical teaching embodied some permanent truths of great significance, which we are liable today to overlook because we associate them with other doctrines which we cannot now accept without much qualification. There are in these matters deep undercurrents at work, natural forces one can call them, or even the invisible hand, that's a nice one, which are operating towards equilibrium. If it were not so, we would not have got on even so well as we have for many decades past. So, you know, the view is that Keynes was already moving on in 1946, and that is my hypothesis, that he would have moved on a long way. He would have spent most of his time, however, not trying to stoke up demand, but fix the banking system. When he thought about stimulus, he would have looked more to the supply side than the demand side. And finally, the great question is whether he would have had different views about the labour market and about wages than he appeared to hold that we know he held when he wrote the general theory.